Chapter 7, The New Testament Rules for the Miraculous Gifts. In 2006, Al Gore released a documentary called An Inconvenient Truth. It grossed worldwide almost $50 million. That's really good for any documentary. Al Gore is trying to teach us all how to save the planet. It was believed that if we don't take drastic action back then, within a decade, it'd be like the end of the world. Whether that is true or not, or just plain hearsay, we are still here, and that's about 20 years later. At least they talked about the coastlines being flooded, which didn't happen. For those that say that was a lie, have you considered this? Al Gore, back then, his utility bill was $30,000 a year. If Al Gore really thought that we needed to take drastic action, you really couldn't tell by the way he lived. When one uses 20 times more electricity than the average home and proclaims that we must make drastic changes, well, did anyone even consider that just might be some profit to what he was doing? So the one that wants to teach us is the one that breaks the very rules that he proclaims that we must follow. With that in mind, cessationists tend to do the same thing. They want to teach us the rules of the gifts of the Spirit, but they are not following the rules themselves. Quote, a fifth biblical argument for cessationism is the New Testament rules for the miraculous gifts. End quote. This is just plain nonsense. What he is claiming is since nobody is following the rules of tongues and prophecy, then that is proof they are no longer tongues and prophecy in the church today. Does that mean that the Corinth people that did not follow the rules of the Lord's Supper, and that is now proof that it's no longer practiced today? If most of us don't follow the speed limit, is that proof there's no speed limit today? No matter what, there will always be those that do not go by the rules, which includes Pastor Tom on this very issue. Quote, in 1 Corinthians 14, Paul established specific guidelines for how the miraculous gifts of tongues and prophecy were to be practiced in the church, end quote. Pastor Tom has broken one of the rules of the miraculous gifts on purpose. Now he wants to teach us, and I'll get to that. He will give 4 rules for tongues and 4 for prophecy. They are simple and to the point. So let's begin with tongues. Quote, a limited number of people were allowed to speak in tongues in corporate worship. Only 2 or 3. And anything more would be a violation of the biblical requirement. End quote. There's no real debate there. Let's continue. Quote, second, only one person was to speak in tongues at a time and each in turn. Fine, no problem there. Next quote. A third rule required that someone with the gift of interpretation be present to interpret what was spoken. End quote. But I would add, if someone else was not present, then one should be prepared to interpret the tongue. To me, that makes sense, but notice this quote. Quote, someone other than the tongue speaker was required to affirm the authenticity of the language and its interpretation. This simply reflects the biblical requirement that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses a matter is confirmed. Geez, how come they don't do that with cessationism? Deuteronomy 19:15 and Matthew 18:16. Paul demanded there be 2 witnesses who could confirm the language spoken and the content and interpretation of the message. End quote. Where's the text for that, folks? Seriously. If someone spoke in tongues and it was Latin, are you suggesting someone that understood Latin had to be there? See my point? Doesn't fit. But Pastor Tom is really just plain wrong on it. 1 Corinthians 14:2 says, for he that speaketh in an unknown tongue speaketh not unto men, but unto God. What is the reason? Well, For no man understandeth him, howbeit in the Spirit he speaketh mysteries. If no man understandeth him, then how could someone confirm what language he is speaking? Again, where is the text that states that an interpreter must confirm what language is being spoken and also resolve the contradiction that no man understands him? If someone could understand that language, that would be a translator and not one that interprets an unknown tongue. Now, the next one is the fourth, not only for tongues, but also for prophecy. Quote, fourth, women weren't allowed to speak in tongues during corporate worship. The women are to keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they are to subject themselves just as the law says. The Greek word for let them be silent is a command, end quote. Now, I do take issue here, and I will answer Pastor Tom once we get to the fourth rule of prophecy. But here's one other quote. In the first century, these were non-negotiable rules for how the gift must operate within the church. Yet I will show that Pastor Tom breaks an important rule. Quote, non-negotiable rule. Did anyone notice that he said in the first century, these were non-negotiable rules? What happened to the second, third, fourth, and even today? What happened to those centuries? What the Apostle Paul wrote in Scripture is to be found not just in the first century, but in every century after that. So now let's look at prophecy. Quote, first in corporate worship, only 2 or 3 people at most were to prophesy. I agree with that. Now, this is my opinion, but the main issue that I have seen being a charismatic was not that too many people prophesying, but one doesn't shut up. They become the speaker. I believe to give a prophecy is for the edifying of the body and not a chance to do a sermonette. Quote, second, the local congregation was to evaluate every prophecy against previous biblical revelation, end quote. It should be the appointed leadership that judges prophecy. I do not believe that new revelation that would become Scripture came that way until the canon was complete. Instead, the apostle doctrine was the rule of the land. The Scriptures are that which is written, whether by a prophet or an apostle. Quote, third, those with the gift of prophecy were to speak one at a time. End quote. Agreed. That is why Acts 2 is not the template for how tongues and prophecy are to be used in the church. 1 Corinthians chapter 14 does set the structure of the use of all gifts of the Spirit. Acts 2 was an event, and 1 Corinthians chapter 14 was a teaching discourse. Quote, fourth, as with tongues, women were allowed to prophesy during corporate worship, end quote. Now, I totally disagree. When the Apostle Paul states that the women keep silent in the churches, that begins a new section. There's definitely an issue of a restriction, but it's not a blanket restriction. Though I don't want to get sidetracked about women, the Apostle Paul said that all can prophesy in 1 Corinthians 14:31. Then go back 3 chapters in 1 Corinthians 11:5. Earlier, we mentioned the prophecy of Joel that spoke of not only men, but of women prophesying in the last days. By the way, it's still the last days. Finally, Philip had 4 virgin daughters that prophesied. Newsflash, when one prophesies, it's not silent. But here's some other quotes I want to consider. Quote, tragically, the charismatic movement at large completely disregards Paul's biblical commands. The wholesale disregard for the Spirit's instruction for how these gifts are to be administered, ordered, and practiced makes this evident. End quote. Now, what about Pastor Tom? Here, he is a deliberate rule breaker, teaching others about what rules to follow. In all honesty, none of us are perfect. Hey, I've done things wrong myself. Now, one Christian can say to another brother at church, you're not following the rules in worship. You are out of order. And yet sometimes that same one that's rebuking his brother doesn't even worship himself. Pastor Tom is doing something in like manner, whether he realizes it or not. Quote, how can charismatics argue for the restoration of the gift of tongues when they refuse to follow the clear biblical rules associated with them, end quote. Actually, the gifts of the Spirit are based on God, and He gives it despite if someone does not follow the rules. In all honesty, I have seen the gifts in practice, and they did follow the rules. Since Pastor Tom refuses to follow the rules himself, he's not in a position to throw stones. How can I say that? Well, read 1 Corinthians 14:39. Wherefore, brethren, covet to prophecy and forbid not to speak with tongues. That is a command, and yet Pastor Tom will not even follow this command as he speaks of charismatics that don't follow the rules. Only God knows in each case who is worse, but how is Pastor Tom being biblical in this matter?